Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar organized by CCMCC on conflict and which is project on conflict and cooperation and management of climate change, and the webinar Lessons from the Field, looking at conflict, cooperation and REDD+. So we're hosting this webinar in Bonn in Germany, linked to the COP, and we've got experts, researchers, practitioners from around the world that are joining us to share their experiences, their research experiences from various projects under the CCMCC. So to get started, we'll move on to quick overview of the project from Corinne. Corinne is the project manager for the CCMCC project. And then what we'll do is we'll draw on a few experiences from those that are working on projects around the world, including Southeast Asia and Africa, drawing on their experience, and then put forward some recommendations at the end. And then we'll have opportunity for hopefully 20 minutes for Q&A at the end, where you get the opportunities to hopefully explore a little bit more on the presentations and the findings and the recommendations, and then also for moving forward. So I'll start off by introducing Corinne, who, as I said, oversees this CCMCC project.
Thank you very much, David, for the introduction. I am very happy to be here. Welcome everyone who's joining in on the webinar. I will give you a brief overview of the background of the CCMCC research program, and that has guided the projects, of which several research findings will be presented during this webinar. So to start with, the name indeed CCMCC stands for Conflict and Cooperation in the Management of Climate Change. It's a research program that's funded by the Department for International Development from the UK, and it's managed by the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research, NWO, through the NWO-WOTRO Science for Global Development. This is where, from which we fund research on development issues within the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research. The CCMCC program started with a call for proposals in 2013, through which 7 research projects were funded, and those projects started in 2014. These projects have been running since then. Some of them are nearing their ends. Others are still have several months to go. So it's basically following 2 lines of research. It looks at conflicts and cooperations around the effects of climate change itself, but it also looks at the effects of climate change policies or interventions, responses to climate change, and how those interrelate with conflict and cooperation dynamics. The ultimate goal of the program is to contribute to the reduction of vulnerability of the poor in the face of climate change and minimize risks of climate change-related violence, which clearly shows that the program has objectives that go beyond just academic findings. They are meant to also contribute to, indeed, the vulnerability of people in the face of climate change. So it's not just an academic exercise that's taking place in the research program. This we can see from the outcomes as they have been defined for the CCMCC program, which is in the first hand leading to an improved understanding of this link between climate change on the one hand, climate change policies on the other hand, and conflicts, and how this then feeds back into increased policy processes in terms of the conflict sensitivity of those policies. So it is about an increased understanding that in turn leads to enhanced conflict sensitivity of policies that are developed in response to climate change issues. And we're not just talking about the policies here on paper, we're also talking about their implementation pathways. So when actually those policies are being rolled out, how can we ensure conflict sensitivity in those pathways? Yeah, so this is a brief overview of the projects that are taking place in CCMCC. It's a bit hard to read. We well understand. I guess that you can, turn to the website if you want more information on the project. This is basically to show you what projects, how they are dispersed around the world geographically, and also what sort of themes they're focusing on. There are projects, there's a huge concentration of projects in South Asia, as we can well see. There are 4 projects working in Nepal, and 2 in Bangladesh and 2 in India. And they are working on various basically resources around which climate change effects appear, but also around which the climate change policies are usually centered. And that may, for instance, be land or water issues, maybe hydropower, maybe agricultural interventions in response to climate change. But it's also focused around forests. And that is actually what we are focusing on today, obviously, in focusing on REDD+, being a response to climate change being developed to counter deforestation. And these projects that are focusing on REDD+ are also dispersed around this map. So we have them working in South Asia, like I said, but also in Southeast Asia and in East and West Africa. And they will be presenting their findings to you today, which we are really excited about, that we can actually contribute to the debates around REDD+ in terms of how it may relate with conflict and cooperation. Just a brief overview of the program, the timeline. In 2013, like I mentioned, we started with the call for proposals. The project started their research activities from January to June 2014, so some earlier in that year, some a bit later. And I guess it merits to tell you also that these projects are not just implemented by academic researchers, but it's a co-creation approach that's being followed. So those academic researchers collaborate with partners from NGOs, from governmental agencies, from CBOs to actually enhance the relevance of the research findings in the projects. Last month, we had 2 meetings, one in Bangladesh and one in Nepal, to share the findings on country level in those 2 countries that, as we saw before, have quite a concentration of projects working there. And now we are at the exciting stage of hosting this webinar, which is presenting all the findings of 4 projects that are focused around REDD+. Tomorrow and the day after, we'll be attending the Development and Climate Days, the COP side event. And tomorrow, a CCMCC hosted session takes place at DNC Days. Anyone who's around, please be welcome to join us there. And just finally, like I said earlier, the end dates of the projects are nearing. Some are ending at the end of this year and some in the summer of next year. Again, that means that there's lots to share at this point in time. So I'm looking forward. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Corinne. So we'll move forward. And next we have Courtney, who's joining us remotely. So she's joining us through Skype.
Okay, so just for a brief overview of what REDD+ is, what the initiatives are, and CCMCC. The general goals of REDD+ are to conserve forested areas in order to absorb carbon emissions. Forests are a carbon sink, and they've been identified as a very necessary component of managing climate change. The other initiatives of REDD+ are to try to create market mechanisms for the sale of sequestered carbon. Now, this relates to the difficulty facing forests and the difficulty in not converting forested lands, which are often referred to in national discourses as wastelands. So there's a real difficulty in convincing national governments and businesses to not convert these lands toward development for-profit initiatives. So the idea is to make the sequestration of carbon profitable. Now, in order to do that, the hope is that there will be a market for people creating carbon emissions to purchase the carbon that is held in forests that are not developed. Now, in order to do that, you have to demarcate and manage specific forest areas for REDD+ implementation. You need to accurately measure the carbon so that it can become a commodity that can be sold on the market, just as you would sell sugar, for example. Now, the difficult thing with REDD+ and with this idea of managing, capturing, and selling carbon from forests is that there are people living in forests, and in order to effectively manage these forests and sell the carbon that they hold, you need to find new alternative livelihoods for the people that are living in REDD+ project area. In addition to that, you need to find financing from donor organizations and donor nations to develop the REDD+ mechanisms. We need government infrastructures, bureaucratic systems in order to manage the project of REDD+. So it seems like a fairly simple idea to sequester and sell carbon in forests to keep them from being converted to special economic zones or plantation agriculture, for example. But it's a very complex set of systems. So what the CCMC project brings to the investigation of REDD+ is our specific focus on conflict and cooperation. As I laid out in the last slide, there are a number of actors involved in this delicate and rather complicated process of selling carbon. And it is rife for conflict. Already we are seeing, there have been many studies showing that there are difficulties in land tenure, for example, in equitable access to the finances coming from REDD+, in finding livelihoods for people. People get excluded from previous livelihoods. And so by focusing specifically on conflict and cooperation, the projects that are going to be presenting their data to you in a little bit will provide some really good and important evidence for the possibilities and what it actually will mean to continue with REDD+ programming in the future. We have multiple locations and multiple projects with all kinds of different experiences of the actual implementation of REDD+ projects on the ground. Okay, so I am with the Mosaic project, and our project was based both in Cambodia and in Myanmar. And we looked at many, many more issues besides REDD+. REDD+ is just one of the projects that we looked at. Our overall approach, excuse me, was to understand the relationships between climate mitigation policies and projects, right, particularly biofuels and REDD+, and large-scale land investments, also known as development, right? And so we took a landscape approach in both of our countries, in Myanmar and in Cambodia, in order to see what was happening when both for-profit development, large-scale land conversions, and climate change policies enter into particular areas in particular countries. Okay, so we're interested in these outcomes, especially we chose Cambodia and Myanmar, especially because they're both considered to be fragile states, places where the rule of law is very flexible, places where there's a plural legal environment, where many different players have, excuse me, have authority at many levels. And so, and as Corinne mentioned earlier, we're focusing on collaborations. So we have academic researchers, we have NGO advocacy organizations, and we also partner with grassroots activist communities that are engaged in trying to manage their own rights and their own claims to land and resources in their areas. And what we're concerned with is how these policies, both development and climate mitigation policies, can be executed in more environmentally and socially just ways. In all of our landscapes, we only had one official working REDD+ project. Myanmar does not have any. They are in a REDD readiness state. Cambodia has 3 others. But I'm just going to focus on this one. This is the Tum Ring REDD project in Kampong Thom, just outside of Prey Long in central Cambodia. And interestingly, this REDD+ project is the only climate mitigation project that did not ignite conflict among the community members, and it was seen as a benefit. Now, part of the reason that this is the case is because of the location of the REDD+ project. It's on the eastern border of the massive forest, in the area that's most easily accessible and in the area that was first developed for plantation agriculture. Mostly rubber concessions are here in this area. And the area was already heavily degraded. Forest concessions first and economic land concessions. And because it's easily accessible from the city, there's been a great deal of pressure from migrant settlements, people encroaching on the forest and clearing land for market crops, and also illegal logging. So in this area, there were local indigenous communities that had lived here for generations, but already many years before, their livelihoods had been completely transformed. So they were, in the early days of economic development in this region, the communities were very involved in designating community forests. And in this area in Kampong Thom, they were the most aggressive, and they designated some 32 community forests in the whole area. This REDD+ project takes 14 of those forests that had very active community members, and the forest itself had been preserved. And I'll show you a map in a little bit, but you'll see that it's almost like a forest for little islands, a little forest archipelago where the community had control of those forests. And so this is the place that the REDD+ project was implemented. Now, the implementers chose this place on purpose because it was so threatened, and the hope was that the having a REDD+ area would help to conserve this forest and would support the communities, which it is doing to a certain extent, right? And the payments are very, very small. There's no great promises for massive funding from ecosystem services. The payments are small, but they are in addition to, and they help communities do what they were already doing, which was desperately trying to protect the community forest commons that they had control over. Now, the troubling thing about this REDD+ project, so you'll see, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't circle the REDD+ project. If you see, so this is the forest map of the area, and you see the yellow circle on what is your right-hand side of the screen. On the left-hand side of the screen, outside of the protected area boundary, you see the tree area that looks a little bit like a backwards C. That is the REDD+ area, the forested area for REDD+. Now, this REDD+ is a part of another forest-based climate change mitigation initiative with the Korean government. It is a government-to-government sponsored climate change initiative in these 2 areas. Now, this is the circled project is a forest restoration project. And now you can see in this map, this is a map of forest cover. You can see that the forest does not need to be restored in this area. And so currently you see the small area of red, which is deforestation. This is the company engaging in deforestation in order to do their forest restoration project, which is essentially creating a monocrop acacia plantation. And so the lack of conflict in this REDD+ case is in fact tragic. REDD+ is designed to keep natural forests standing. And in this case, while it didn't create any direct conflicts for the communities that were living in the area where the project was implemented, it was used as a counterweight for a development as usual industrial tree plantation in a forest that would have been a perfect place to put a REDD+ forest restoration project. So in this, our policy recommendations are quite simple. The first one to policymakers and project implementers is to try not to be cynical and profit-minded when administering projects that respond to the threat of global climate change. For REDD+ projects, favor direct support over market mechanisms. Do not make financial promises that cannot be delivered to the communities living in these forests. And do make direct and regular payments from the project to the communities. Funding that goes to the communities should not be dependent on the instability and the fickleness of any kind of market mechanism. Communities need to have funding in order to support their efforts at forest management and forest protection. Project implementers should discourage small bounded areas for community enforcement. These have less use for communities and you get less buy-in from communities. Larger areas that have more benefit and that more readily reflect the areas that communities are used to living and working in and managing have much better effects for REDD+ programs. And the final recommendation is, again, quite simple to say and tragically difficult to do. Enforce national level laws regarding forest clearing, homesteading, and timber extraction. And that is all from me. Thank you very much.
So I'm presenting the core project, which is conflict in REDD project, covering 3 countries, Nepal, Vietnam, and Mexico. And we're looking at how REDD could be a driver for conflict, but also how REDD can be transformative. So REDD can actually transform conflicts, so bring positive, sustainable outcomes from the conflicts, looking at issues that can be the drivers of conflicts and really addressing the underlying issues. The project builds on various initiatives by the project partners, including from RECOF's work. So RECOF's been doing conflict and REDD work since 2011, and also builds on various projects, capacity building projects under Norwegian-funded REDD+ grassroots capacity building project, and also Green Mekong projects that we've had from USAID. And basically the aim of the project is to strengthen the evidence. So it's research focused evidence on how REDD+ can be a driver of conflict. And as I said, also how it can transform. So for example, facilitate cooperation among different conflict actors, stakeholders, in new conflicts as well as existing conflicts. The project is in Vietnam. It builds on research in Vietnam, also communication products in Vietnam as well as a training program component as well, with training on FPIC, free, prior, informed consent, as well as conflict transformation in REDD. So while we're doing the research in Vietnam, Nepal, and Mexico, we have the opportunity to scale it up, for example, through Windrock, who's one of the project partners, as well as RECOF. So the main findings of the research that's been done in Mexico, Vietnam, and Nepal, and this touches on some of the main findings that Courtney's also shared. Issue of poor coordination, and this is something that particularly stands out between different government departments, but also, to be honest, between donors and also NGOs as well. So how you would have under REDD+, you would have different departments working with REDD+, while at the same time you would also have other departments that are actually completely undermining efforts to address issues of deforestation and degradation. And the research has come up with quite a few examples of that in all the countries where there's one message or one activity by, for example, Ministry of Mining or Department of Mining, and then the Department of National Parks, for example, or Department of Forestry is actually trying to address the activities of the mining companies that are actually driving the deforestation. Poor information management, and this again was touched on by Courtney, is that there's a significant problem with false expectations from REDD project proponents, particularly with the amount of resources, the amount of money, and the amount of support that is flying around with REDD+, and how communities, for example, in Vietnam, in project sites there, have the expectation that a significant amount of money is going to come to the communities within a very short period of time. And then when this doesn't happen, it leads to a great deal of exacerbation and creates a level of distrust between the different stakeholder groups. And this is also reflected as this poor information management is a reflection of the weak capacities that you'll find within government, but also within NGOs as well. And this, again, all of these you could talk about way beyond REDD as well, thinking about how these are found under other projects as well, and then also how these could be a driver of conflict. One of the key, and these are the two key components I would suggest in terms of if you were to give priority of the issues, is the weak legal and regulatory frameworks that exist for example, addressing the issues that could create conflict from REDD+, in terms of, the conflicting laws, but also the lack of recognition of customary rights and weak statutory rights. And a great deal of research has been published that actually emphasizes that. I mean, it's all these academic papers where they talk about in terms of tenure as the fundamental be-all of how REDD could exacerbate conflicts, create new conflicts, and how REDD's, the sustainability, the viability of REDD can be undermined by weak tenure. But as one thing is the research has also emphasized that REDD has also created many opportunities for transforming conflicts. It's focused on many of the development organizations, donor organizations on the issue of forests and forest management and trying to address deforestation and degradation. And with this focus comes opportunities to actually really create systems and governance framework, for example, that really can strengthen the rights of local communities. And this really are these opportunities really do provide real opportunities for scaling up, for synergies as well, and something that in terms of we emphasize when we move forward to the recommendations. And one thing also for the findings and research is that when you're looking at the priorities of trying to address a conflict, trying to transform a conflict, is that it's not that all the issues are the same. Of course, they're different priorities. And the way that the research has looked at it is looking at the sustainability of any interventions to address the conflicts that are there, and considering that these conflicts can be from one end can be violent, but also latent conflicts that really are about attitudes and about distrust. And thinking about if you were to prioritize certain causes of conflict, whether underlying causes or less or more superficial issues, as it were. So the findings from the research has found that basically really the legal and policy side and the tenure side are the real issues. And if you're to really get sustainable outcomes from addressing the conflict, then these are the priority areas. But in the meantime, need to also focus on the I suppose, the lesser issues, as it were, which is capacities to manage the conflicts, for example, leadership capacities, and issues of quality of resources. So in terms of if you were to take a stepwise approach, then maybe starting with the smaller issues, as it were, such as capacities of conflict management and leadership, and then move up the scale, addressing the laws. And then just going to the main recommendations of the project, in terms of building on the previous slide, looking at the bigger picture in terms of aiming for transformation, so addressing the tenure issues and addressing the weak laws. And one of the other findings in the research is the opportunities that are there from REDD, but also from FLEG VPA, and it's absolutely fundamental to synergize from those, but also to actually further develop FLEG VPA and REDD Plus to really address the issues of tenure and rights and laws that would strengthen the rights of communities. And the research emphasizes that in terms of it's not about that companies and governments must give tenure to communities. It's the rationale for doing that in terms of it really creates sustainable outcomes, transformative outcomes. And then looking forward, again, wanting to emphasize the FLEG VPA and the REDD, the synergies there really are, the opportunities, the doors that both these initiatives open to actually addressing the big underlying causes of conflicts in forests in Southeast Asia and Nepal, for example, and the opportunities to address those, ensuring sustainable outcome. And then the other thing was also FLEG VPA and REDD, the coordinations issues that are coming up with the development of FLEG VPA negotiations in the countries in REDD is the coordination issues there that need to be addressed. And then the final recommendation is the capacity development program. Really are issues with leadership, also with conflict management skills, capacities to address conflict in a transformative and sustainable way, such as, for example, FPIC, but also conflict mediation, leadership skills as well. So you can see from the publications that we'll put in the folder with this webinar that there's more details about the recommendations and steps for moving forward with these. So now, after my presentation, we'll give TT one more try.
Okay, because I start to see how it is important to look at the REDD plus, because the REDD is not coming in Indonesia into a peaceful or just place where nothing happened, because it is really actually REDD and forest is a political issue in Indonesia. Why it is important? It is because Indonesia is composed of around 17,600 islands, and the land mass is 70%, or around 131 million is covered by forests. So the third largest area of tropical forest is in Indonesia. But the deforestation rate is 1.17 million hectares a year. And there is an analysis why this massive loss of forest. The analysis made by the Indonesian governments with other international agencies in the context of REDD preparation in Indonesia said that the main driver of the deforestation in Indonesia is actually the land use change for agricultures like the plantation, mining, illegal logging, forests, and land fires, particularly for the clearing of for big-scale plantation and drained peatlands in Kalimantan. And so, therefore, there's a massive support for Indonesia to do the REDD. The next slide, please. So before, so sorry, it's not the next, but stay in the next, the first slide. Yeah, so the deforestation in Indonesia is actually linked to complex structures in the Indonesian development, because Indonesian development is based on the economic growth and then from the extraction of natural resources, that's including forests. And also to protect the investment, there is also a doctrine of national security and defense. And this doctrine allows the military to intervene into the forestry and environmental sectors in Indonesia, with several laws permit that. The next slide. Next slide, please. So it means the REDD land in Indonesia, with the political situations of national security, with the economic situations of the push for the economic growth based on the extraction of natural resources. On the other hand, there is an uncertain and unclear tenure issue. So the government states that the 70% of the forest is actually owned by the state. But where is the 70%? It's only 10% announced. So there is a misinterpretation where the forests are, and therefore which one is already inhabited by the indigenous people and local transmigration people, and which one is actually for the big scales company for plantation and other land use change. So the uncertainties is lead also to the violations of rights of the indigenous people. It's like particularly when they already they feel that the land where they live already for generations one day will be claimed by a company, because the company become a license and permit from the government. So this conflict of unclear tenure, not respecting the forest dependent community is very clear, reflected in many places in Indonesia. Another issue is about illegal logging. Many times the local people are suspected as the illegal loggers by the governments or by many military also. But actually the illegal logging in big scale is not by the local people, but it's really backed by the military and government officials. And then the other difficulties in management of the REDD+ in Indonesia is the non-coordinated program among the ministries, though they work in silos. Although REDD issue is actually can cover several ministries. So Indonesia is one of the examples, the difficulties and challenging faced by the REDD+ program in Indonesia. So actually the recommendation to deal with the situation is actually clarifying the land tenure and the legal frameworks related to the forest sectors and then people in the forest. Important is to protect the rights of forest dependent communities, vulnerable groups, and also the indigenous peoples living in the area of the forest. It is important to address the underlying causes of deforestation and forest degradations. For example, reduce the expansions of the big-scale plantation and extractive industries and mining. And then important also to remove laws and policies that allowing military to intervene into the REDD measures and activities. And better coordination and communication among ministry and government agency to deal with the forest loss in Indonesia. I think that's the last slide. And it was a situation as an example, the difficult situation because REDD were related to issue of politics and economic of a country. Now we go to our projects, the investing in land and water. with two cases, with two projects within this. The work is in Ethiopia and in Indonesia, where the objective is to understand what happened on the local level in terms of conflict and cooperations when there is a climate finance or projects, especially in this case, REDD, come to that place. And then to look for evidence-based lessons from the case studies in Indonesia and Ethiopia, and to bring this lesson learned for the climate policy making and decision making of finance projects, for example, the Green Climate Funds. So if we look from the Indonesian case first, it is a REDD plus in the national park in Meru Betiri, that is in the eastern part of Java Islands. So the objective of the REDD Plus project is actually to prevent community to log illegally into the national park and giving them activities that can improve their livelihood. But our case studies and lesson learned shows that it will be very difficult to address illegal logging in the national park through a REDD Plus projects, because the illegal logging is not conducted by the community surrounding the national park, but mostly massively by powerful actors from outside the community, backed by military personnel and also government officials. That's the first lesson learned. And the other thing is, if a REDD project holders in the case of illegal logging already suspect the poor community as the illegal logger, then the community just feel they don't want to cooperate. They just want to disengage from the projects. Actually, if they are engaged, they are the one that can safeguarding the forest by giving like early warning informations to the forest management of logging activities, as an examples. So the community itself, the other communities who are not involved in the projects, also stated that actually they wanted to be part of it if they are informed, because the conflict is how they can do agriculture activity in the rehabilitation zone of the national park. So the closed zone is actually the core zone, but there is a rehabilitation zone that the community can use. They say if they can use it, utilize the land, and can get income to improve their livelihood, then they are willing actually to be part of the projects. And for the community they were not involved in the projects, they were involved in the projects, it is clearly a lack of information about the whole activities. They are only involved in the planting activities, but not explains about what is REDD and what is the goal. And also there is no information and discussions about the benefit or co-benefits. So it means the REDD projects there is ignore the whole safeguard scheme that is made for the implementation of REDD in Indonesia. So at the Ethiopian case, the climate finance projects are framed in terms of benefit sharing, which carries the risk that less attention to be paid to the distribution of costs, risks, and responsibility and rights that are also part of climate finance interventions. And the second is climate finance projects has an over-reliance on institutional design models for intervention and strong emphasis on finding the right organizational fit for benefit sharing. While the organizational structure doesn't seem to be the source of problems encountered in various projects, such as elite capture, patronage, social exclusion, and increase of conflict over natural resources. And the third is, despite the safeguards set for climate finance projects, the projects in practice narrowly focus on nature conservation and often lead to fencing the natural resources and granting and closure of common pool resources with exclusive user rights to a small group of people, affecting the livelihood of other people who used to rely on the resources, in particular the indigenous people, farmers, livestock keepers, and groups that are marginalized for social, political reasons and local communities. The main recommendations from the lesson learned from the both projects in both countries, Indonesia and Ethiopia, is the significance of already existing community in the forest management system cannot be ignored or overlooked, including the effect on the new climate finance projects. It is important for the multi-stakeholder dialogues and multi-stakeholder decision makings to be respected and implemented in the practice when discussing about the result-based payment projects. It is crucial to develop a careful understanding on the phenomenon of land grabbing and the fast-range diverse context in which it unfolds. And it is also, as the fourth recommendation is, an integrated approach to multiple natural resources is very crucial and important.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Titi. Very, very interesting. You've inspired a couple of questions I see already, so that's great. Please do keep the questions coming. So what we'll do now is we'll move on to Patrick, and Patrick is joining us from Nairobi.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, taking you through the case of the project of Tiki. Tiki has got a geographical expansion of working in 3 countries, that is in Burkina Faso, Ghana, and Kenya. And in particular, I'll be focusing on the REDD Plus initiatives happening in Kenya, in the case of Enesupuke in this case, giving an overview of what conflict and cooperation has brought in. In this case, it is good to note that REDD Plus actions in Kenya are consistent with the Constitution. It's a constitutional requirement for government to oblige to the REDD Plus initiative or actions that promote REDD Plus. It also demands that a clean, secure, and sustainable environment must be there, and calls for rehabilitation and of the degraded forest. And this case, Enesupuke is one of those degraded forests, especially in our coverage area in Narok County, in the southern part of Kenya. And this call for sustainable management of drylands forest and user compensation for environmental services. The user compensation attempts to look at how communities can benefit or can be compensated in the event of the rehabilitation affecting their livelihoods, or in the event that they are affected in a human way for the environmental services and restoration to take place. It is good to note that the forestry sector has the greatest mitigation potential in Kenya, and Kenya is regarded as one of the biggest carbon sinks in Africa. And interestingly, where we sit here in Narok, we have 4 indigenous forests, which are the main lifeline for Kenya, being graded as one of the greatest carbon sinks in Kenya, in Africa, sorry. Yeah, it is good to know that improving the evidence base is a critical step for enhancing policy and programs development and for implementing the cost-effective mitigation measures. And our objectives in this, the case of the Nosopokia or the reforestation project, is we are trying to look at, we were looking at competing claims between various stakeholders at all multi-level stages. The contested land ownership, or who owns the lands in the context of REDD Plus in this case, who benefits at the end of the day, intra and interdynamic of the forest rehabilitation. In this case, intra and interdynamics come into play between the local communities within and around the forest area. Cooperations noted in the project, we were looking at cooperations that possibly this initiative has brought in, sustainability and any other compensation in future through the carbon trading. Lesson learned from this include that there is a need respect of human rights or the rights of the indigenous people and local communities, including subjecting them to FPIC. And I'm happy that someone else prior to this have mentioned FPIC, which is free, prior and informed consent. That the natural resource, which is the competing factor here between the various stakeholders, the government of Kenya, the county government, which are regional government in this case, the local policy practitioners, which happen to be the civil societies, the local communities, all calls for equitable benefit sharing, which was missing in this context. The benefits and proceeds from this initiative in the forest sector helps improve the well-being of the communities living within and around the forest areas. It was also noted that there is a lot of gender disparity, bringing about exclusion and inclusion, especially in the pastoral communities in the context of climate change. Women are most affected, but they have less roles that they try to play when it comes to such REDD Plus projects. Contribution to broader sustainable development, looking at a national and global level, and also full and effective participation and access of information is very key, because mostly these initiatives, the REDD Plus initiatives, especially in Kenya, are shrouded with a lot of secrecy, just with a very few information being relayed by the project proponent. And also there is need for compliance with the national and international standard that adhere or calls for the respects of rights of the local communities, or rather the communities living within and around the forest. And also there is a need and a call for a multi-stakeholders approach to ensure balanced stakeholder participation other than the skewed. When we talk about the stakeholders participation in Kenya through the REDD Plus initiative is that we have the stakeholders guidelines, stakeholders engagement guidelines. And this one attempts to give a threshold of who in this context must be involved in the participation, and at what threshold of percentage participation is it considered that there was at least an average participation by the communities within and around. Lessons learned from this case is that there are various competing claims which will continue to exist even in future, and we don't see an opportunity that this one is going out very soon. The new thing is that there is synergize and new dynamics of cooperation, and especially between several actors at several multi-levels and stages. In this, I mean that several synergies have been forged between policy practitioners, research institutes, the civil societies and communities, in understanding and trying to see that every aspect of the project has got everybody on board. The contribution by CMCC in this project is that it has managed to bring about several stakeholders climate change conflict sensitive tool on mapping out. And this is one of the initiatives the project has brought, and it has brought the synergized relationship and cooperation between the several partners in this project. In the other contribution that the CMCC through TICI has contributed is the mainstreaming of climate change programs in development. We mean that every other aspect of development happening within the county, or rather the regional area, is that there is need, and it has been mainstreamed now into law that climate change sensitivity must be mainstream in all development programs. Another good contribution, possibly just arising from the synergized relationship and cooperation, is that there is a very robust, or rather very active knowledge sharing platform that brings out all these dynamic stakeholders to put their minds together and trying to see how they can work together for the interest of the communities. In the recommendation, yes, in the context of cooperations and conflict sensitivity, there is need to have a strong legal framework, which in this case is lacking. I mean, in the context, most of our policies are not conflict sensitive, and that is what the recommendation we are making, that a legal framework need to be there in place that try to anchor and bring sensitivity at all stages. And then also communities in the management of natural resources are pivotal, and that they can address exclusion disparity among the project proponent. In this case, I mean that if, in this case, communities are involved from stage one in the management of these natural resources, and in any way they are the custodian, then a lot of disparity that have been foreseen and have been noted in other projects will be considered. At least they can be able to find a way out to come out of those challenges. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks for that, Patrick. Very, very interesting, and builds nicely on the previous presentations as well. So again, thank you. So we have a few questions from the attendees, the audience as it were. So from Ronicorn asking a question about Prey Lang in Cambodia. So Courtney, I'll be asking you to address that. Also from Ronicorn as well is the question for TT regarding Indonesia. And then we have a couple of questions from Arnim. So what I'll do is, again, when the experts, as it were, are responding to the questions, I'll ask them to unmute their mics. Oh, sorry, and I see a further question from Diego as well. So what we'll do is we'll start off with Ronicorn's question as the most popular question for Courtney about Prey Lang. So Courtney, if you can hear me, Ronicorn's asking about in terms of what local communities, the local people have been doing before the project, and then they're affected by the project in a positive or negative sense. And it'll be good if you could provide some insight on Ronicorn's question.
Yes, that's good. It's a great question. Thank you. And in this limited time, I wasn't able to go into as much detail on that, so I'm really glad that you asked it. It's interesting, as I said in the presentation, and this kind of connects to the question that Arnim asks as well. So one of the big problems with REDD+ that researchers are writing about is that it disrupts local livelihoods because they're not allowed in the REDD+ project zones to continue with their normal activities, particularly Swidden agriculture, Swidden cultivation practices. In the case of Prey Lang, and it's interesting, in this particular location, right, if we go to the slide that has the map on it, in this particular location, the REDD+ project is outside of the designated protected area, okay, and it is before the companies came, okay, all of these white squares on the map that I'm showing you here, all these white squares are plantations. These are all company concessions. And before the companies came, the people living in this area were involved in traditional practices, indigenous shifting cultivation, resin tapping, and generally using the forest as the grocery store and raising their families accordingly in the forest. But starting in 2004 was the first plantation, and then from 2007 to 2012, all of these plantations in the area that you see came in. They were all awarded as concessions, and the deforestation is just phenomenal, and the incursion of rubber plantations, and also local people clearing the forest to farm market crops, especially cassava. So the REDD Plus project was instituted in 2015, in early 2015, and so the reason, and so actually in an environment where the local communities have had nothing but negative effects on their livelihoods and on their desire to maintain the forest, even with the community forests, it gave them tenure. So the community forests from the Forest Administration gave the local people tenure of this area, but it was still very, very difficult to stop the encroachment and to stop especially the illegal logging, the selective logging. Now with REDD Plus, it hasn't necessarily added a lot of enforcement capacity, but it does two things for the community. And so really they were the people that live there that we worked with, their feeling was this, that the REDD Plus it's not doing enough. It really doesn't let them do the kind of forest management that they want to do. It really doesn't enhance their access to forest resources, but it does give them some legitimacy, and it gives them more individuals from the outside that are invested in protecting this area. The Forest Administration is administering this REDD Plus project with the Korean Forest Service, and all of these people are now invested, just like the local communities, in protecting this forest area. And it gives the local communities some extra funds to do patrols and to just for little things like buying gas and having food and having new hammocks to stay overnight and to generally manage the area. So that's the situation. It's a little bit unique in that the REDD Plus is coming in after people's lives have been destroyed by development, and it's giving them a little bit of extra assistance to try to maintain the forests in their area.
Okay, so Titi, Diego was asking in terms of about the benefits and the fragmented institutions. So do you want to provide some thoughts there? And then we can also move on to the Indonesia question directly afterwards. So Titi, if you want to start us off with that, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I read the question is about it's actually about the landscape financing and how to avoid conflict and so on. But I think the important starter for REDD Plus in Indonesia is the 7 regional consultations and a report that's saying that there are 7 underlying causes of deforestation and forest degradations in Indonesia. So the first causes is actually the land use change, as I told you in the presentation before. So it means the land use change for plantation and mining. So that should be addressed. The question is, many activities is actually not addressing how to make the plantation mining companies accountable for the deforestation they causes. The question is whether they provide whether the government demand them to provide particular sum of money to restore the area that already destroyed by their activities. I don't see in that direction. So it means if the governments can push the companies to be accountable and responsible by putting a sum of money to restore the situations and the degraded forest, then I think there is enough money for Indonesia to do the deforestation, to reduce the deforestations. And also, we need to understand if we want to avoid the conflict. Conflict cannot be solved by finance only. Conflict can be solved if we understand the causes of the conflicts. And in the forest issue, the conflict within the governments, companies, local community, indigenous community, it is actually about the land tenure rights. And I think it doesn't need financing to make the government also giving the rights to the people. So the whole questions about finance is actually good to make a framework for analyzing or for making evidence-based result and suggestions how to deal with the situations, but not for paying particular projects that at the end still continue the pattern of not respecting the rights of the people, or using people only as a cheap labor to plant the seedlings that provide by the REDD+ projects.
That's fantastic. So basically, Diego's question was talking about the difficulties we face, that the research has found with regards to dealing with fragmented institutions at the local level. And then the second part of the question is the issue of the top-down climate policies dealing with those local fragmented institutions. Certainly from the research and generally for the work of RECOF, in terms of there is this issue of this, as it were, the fragmented institutions, the poor coordination, whether within communities, for example, and then the local government offices. And then, of course, it goes up as well in terms of the expectations that the local government offices have in relation to working with the central government offices and the different messages that are carried forward there. I mean, it is something that the research has found from the research and also from the work of RECOF. It's investing in that process. It's the process in terms of building the capacities, for example, to help the institutions, the local government, the local community institutions, working with the local government and ensuring, for example, they have the capacities to negotiate if that's the case, but also mechanisms to help local government work with the different institutions that you find in the local community, whether they're formal institutions or informal institutions. And it's something the research has highlighted, and I imagine it's the same with the other research. It's something that's worth investing in, and it goes way beyond REDD, of course. And then the second part of the question is looking at the benefits, the top-down side of it from climate policies being incompatible with local governance configurations. And again, it's a very valid point, but it's something that from the research that we've had under the COCOR project is the opportunities that REDD and FLEG VPA, for example, have had to open the doors to addressing many of the issues that communities have with regards to rights and tenure, and how, while REDD and FLEG VPA can exacerbate those, also, as I said, the opportunities that it provides. So the point about the top-down climate policies, for example, originating from Paris Agreement and so on, and then going down and going down and down, that is very valid, but also at local level in terms of it does provide the opportunities. Okay, and with my voice ending the Q&A, we'll just wrap up a few things for the housekeeping. And again, at this point, just thank you very much to CCMCC for hosting and organizing this event, to Claire for sorting out all the logistics, And please feel free to email us at the contacts on the webpage if you have any additional questions, and then we can respond to those over the coming days. So thanks again to all that have contributed.